We've been going through the history of the world, really, from a biblical perspective, which means right now we're focusing on the history of Israel, which God used, of course, in a special way in world history. We saw that they were meant to be a light to the rest of the nations, that the distinction between how they lived and the blessings that God gave them and the nations around them was supposed to wake those nations up to the reality of God and the goodness of God, and ultimately even the justice of God. The plan of God has never failed for Israel, and even through their failures, he has proven himself time and time again to be both good and righteous judicially in his treatment of them, and then in his restoration. He's proven himself very clearly to be a forgiving God, to be a faithful God, which is a great encouragement for us. And we looked last week at the priesthood that he set up and the way that he chose a specific line. First, the family of Aaron, and then more specifically, the line of Eleazar, Aaron's son, and the line later of Zadok, who came from Eleazar, and they were his chosen priests who went between him and the people, and he's promised them even a future priesthood in the Messiah's reign. They will stand before him to minister to him. And today we're going to look at the kingship and how it got started, and we're going to look at some very familiar passages, because this is the part of the story that's most interesting to us, the call of Saul and then the call later of David. And we're going to see how God established this aspect of the kingdom of Israel's life and ministry, and the implications that it had, the results that it had later in their history, and also the reasons for it. But to recap a little bit, in the book of 1 Samuel, near the beginning, we are introduced to the character of Samuel, who was a transitionary figure. He was the last judge of Israel after Eli. Eli was the second to last judge, who was also a priest. Samuel was also an interim priest, you could say. He wasn't a Levite, but he took on the role of a priest for a certain time in Israel's history. And he was also the first prophet that anointed and then provided counsel and instruction to one of Israel's kings, which was a role that several other prophets took on later. So he's a very important, a very pivotal character in the story of the Old Testament. And one of the key events in this transition between the period of the judges and the period of the kings and prophets was the defeat of Israel by the Philistines and the capturing of the ark, and the resulting, along with that, you had the death of Eli and his two sons. The priestly line that was caring for the nation at that time was ended. Not completely, but there wasn't anyone old enough to take on the priesthood that they left. So when the ark came back to Israel, it did not immediately go back to the tabernacle and have worship reinstated just as it was. Let me go to 1 Samuel chapter 7. And the picture is of the men of Beth Shemesh looking up and seeing the ark coming on the cart. And if you remember, many of them looked inside the ark, and because of their irreverence, the judgment that had been on the Philistines came upon them as well, and several of them died. And in verse 1 of chapter 7, we see the men of Kirith Jearim came and brought the ark of Yahweh and brought it into the house of Abinadab on the hill, and set apart Eleazar his son as holy in order to keep the ark of Yahweh. Not in order to serve as a priest, but just to keep the ark. That was their job, their ministry at that time. Now it happened from the day when the ark remained at Kirith Jearim that the time was long. It was 20 years. And all the house of Israel lamented after Yahweh. So their passion for God grew. Their desire for God grew through this period in which they couldn't go and worship him in the way that they had, in which he was in a way separated from them. And Samuel came in to that situation, to that sense of need that the nation felt, that absence of God that they felt, and led an incredible revival in just the next verse. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, if you are to return to Yahweh with all your heart, then remove the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and set your hearts toward Yahweh and serve him alone, and he will deliver you from the hand of the Philistines. It's amazing whenever anybody, even back as far as Jacob dealing with his own family, whenever anybody says, let's turn to Yahweh, let's have a revival, let's get rid of our idols, there are always idols there to be gotten rid of. Somebody always has them. So the sons of Israel removed the Baals and the Ashtaroth and served Yahweh alone at that time. Then Samuel said, gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray to Yahweh for you. And we're going to see, and you will see if you read the rest of 1 Samuel in this time period specifically, Mizpah was a very important place in the ministry of Samuel particularly. It was a gathering place, a religious gathering place for Israel. And they gathered to Mizpah and drew water and poured it out before Yahweh and fasted on that day and said there, we have sinned against Yahweh. And Samuel judged the sons of Israel at Mizpah. Then the Philistines heard that the sons of Israel had gathered to Mizpah, and they assumed that the Israelites were forming an army, planning to overthrow their rule, because they were the dominant force, the overlords of Israel at that time, because of the victory that they had already achieved. And so they came out to fight against these people who had gathered for a revival, not for a battle. And Samuel led them in battle against the Philistines. And this is when he set up the stone during the process, called it Ebenezer, saying, thus far Yahweh has helped us, down in verse 12. Which is where the line comes from in the song, Come thou fount of many blessings. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come. They defeated the Philistines, received some relief from them, some independence. The Philistines were definitely still the greater power and still the dominant country, but they had relative freedom for a good number of years. And in verse 15, thus Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. And he used to go annually on circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah. And he judged Israel in all these places. These were all places with spiritual significance for the nation, where people would gather to worship at this time. But his return would be to Ramah, for his house was there. That was where his parents were from. So even though he spent time, apparently, after the death of Eli and his sons, he went back to his parents' family and lived with them. And there he judged Israel, and he built there an altar to Yahweh. So understanding this period of time gives us a little bit more insight and a little bit more mercy toward the Israelites who continued to sacrifice at these places and in the high places after the ark was brought to Jerusalem. Is it was what they had been doing, and in the time of Samuel, it was accepted. But there was a reluctance to accept the change, to recognize that God had chosen a place at that time. But right here, the emphasis isn't on a place, it's on a person. You go to God through Samuel. He is the religious leader of the nation, the one that God has chosen, the judge that God has appointed at this time. Which is why it was such a problem later when Saul offered a sacrifice to God. He wasn't a Levite. Samuel wasn't a Levite either. But the religious leadership of the nation had been given to Samuel and not to Saul. Samuel had a right to build altars and make sacrifices to God throughout the land. He led a great spiritual revival in Israel, but he did not reestablish tabernacle worship. As a non-Levite, it's not really something he could have done. It happened when Samuel was old, at the beginning of chapter 8, that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. And this is the one real failing that we see in Samuel, and it is also a very understandable failing, considering his own upbringing, the example of fathership that he had in Eli. Fathership, effective fathership, was not a skill that Samuel learned, unfortunately, and he was not able to pass on to his sons, either through neglect or we can't necessarily blame him alone either. His sons' choices are their own choices, but it seems significant that his sons went largely the way that Eli's sons went, in accepting bribes, causing justice to be turned aside. They were greedy for gain. They were selfish. And as a result, the elders of Israel came together to Samuel at Ramah. In verse 5, they said to him, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." And we're going to get a little bit of insight into why they asked for this now later on. It wasn't simply the fact that Samuel was growing old. It's because they feared other nations, that they didn't trust God essentially to raise up a deliverer for them. They wanted an on-call deliverer, someone who was always there to lead them into battle, to protect them from their enemies. So Samuel was very upset about this. Of course, a deep sense of personal rejection. But God let him know, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Go ahead and appoint the person that I will show you. So as we read on, Saul was anointed by Samuel. Then after he was anointed, Samuel called the nation together, and by lot, they chose who was going to be king. And again, Saul was chosen by lot, proving that God was in control of the result and knew beforehand who he was going to choose. But at that time, it's hard to say that Saul was really the king fully of the nation, that he wasn't acknowledged right away by everyone. Some did, some didn't. It was after that, when Saul rescued Jabesh Gilead from the Ammonites, that people really accepted him. And before that point, he went back to being a farmer. He was tilling the ground of his own estate when he heard the news that Jabesh Gilead needed to be rescued, that they were under threat. And he showed some real guts, some real courage. He took over, threatened everybody if they didn't join him, that he was going to chop up their oxen if they didn't come with him and Samuel to fight. And after that whole situation, Saul was reestablished as king. This was a significant turning point for the nation. It was a moving away from, of course, the whole judge system to a more permanent system of rule, similar in some ways to the reign of judges, but kind of a split. The judges had double authority. They had spiritual authority and political authority. They led the nation in war, but they were also the one that people came to hear the word of God explained, applied to their situations. And it was really a carrying over of the ministry that Moses and Joshua had. Moses was the judge, and people would come to him to have their disputes settled. And this was something that God anticipated happening, this shift. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 17. Starting in verse 14. Deuteronomy 17:14. He says this, "When you enter the land which Yahweh your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you, whom Yahweh your God chooses. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your brother. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself. He shall not multiply wives for himself," in verse 17, "or else his heart will turn away," which happened with Solomon, we see very clearly. "Nor shall he greatly increase silver or gold for himself," which Solomon also did. And verse 18, "Now it will be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear Yahweh his God, to carefully observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or the left, so that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his sons in the midst of Israel. It was very important to God that the king remembered that he was under the authority of God, that he was not above the rest of his brothers in that respect. They were all, God was still their king, ultimately. And the human king had a responsibility to obey him. And that's the real issue with Saul and the way that his reign went. He took more authority for himself than he had a right to, and in the process neglected the commands, the direct commands that God had given him. 1 Samuel 12. 1 Samuel 12, verses 7 through 12. This is a speech that Samuel gave to the people, part of a speech, at Saul's what would you call that? Reaffirmation as king after his victory when they came to reestablish him in the kingship. This is what Samuel said to the people. Verse 7. So now take your stand that I may judge you before Yahweh concerning all the righteous acts of Yahweh, which he did for you and your fathers. When Jacob went into Egypt and your fathers cried out to Yahweh, then Yahweh sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot Yahweh their God. So he sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried out to Yahweh and said, we have sinned, because we have forsaken Yahweh and have served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. But now deliver us from the hands of our enemies, and we will serve you. This is the cycle that we see in the book of Judges. Then Yahweh sent Jerubbaal, which is the other name for Gideon, and Bedan, and Jephthah, and Samuel. So Samuel very clearly puts himself in this category. He was given power over the Philistines to help the Israelites defeat them. He delivered Israel in the same way that the others had. And he delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around, so that you lived in security. But you saw that Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, came against you. And you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, although Yahweh your God was your king. So it's because the Ammonites came against them, they got afraid and they forgot that in every danger they had faced so far, God had raised up a deliverer. Without their help, God had done it. And instead of seeking him, instead of praying to God for a deliverer, they demanded, as I said before, a permanent deliverer, someone to lead their armies and protect them. And this demonstrated a lack of faith in God and a forgetfulness of all that God had done for them in the past. Verse 13, so now behold the king whom you have chosen, whom you have asked for. And behold, Yahweh has set a king over you. If you will fear Yahweh and serve him, and listen to his voice, and not rebel against the command of Yahweh, then both you and also the king who reigns over you will follow Yahweh your God. But if you will not listen to the voice of Yahweh, but rebel against the command of Yahweh, then the hand of Yahweh will be against you, as it was against your fathers. So he establishes again very clearly, this king is under the Lord's rule as well. The situation hasn't really changed. God is still the king, and he still demands obedience. He has not given his position to someone else. And so, of course, we know how things turn out. Saul does have a victory over the Philistines, really through his son Jonathan. Jonathan is the one with faith. And the Philistines are defeated for a while. In chapter 14. But we do have a situation earlier on, actually pretty soon after. Yeah, in chapter 13, we see Saul offer the sacrifice because the people are afraid, they're deserting him. He offers the sacrifice before Samuel gets there. He takes on a role that God has not given him. And later on, his disobedience takes on a more pronounced form, a more obvious form, and Samuel makes it even more clear that God has rejected him as king. You'll remember that when the Israelites came toward the land of Canaan, led by Moses, that the Amalekites would not let them through their land, but came out to fight them. And this is an example of very delayed justice, which we often see in the Old Testament. God has a very long memory. He remembers the sins that were committed against his people, and always, even though it seems like a long time for us, brings about punishment on those nations. In in chapter 15, verse 2, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. And so he tells Saul, go against the Amalekites and completely destroy them. Saul sends a message to the Kenites who were living with the Amalekites saying, depart from them, because I don't want to destroy you with them, because you showed loving kindness to all the sons of Israel when they came up from Egypt. So Saul shows an understanding here of what God is accomplishing and a good bit of wisdom. But he also shows a lack of control over his men and a lack of spine when his men are unwilling to slaughter everything. And it may have been Saul's personal decision to leave the king alive as well. But the king of the Amalekites and many of their choicest animals were not slaughtered. They were brought back as spoil with the excuse that they were for a sacrifice to God. That's what Saul said to Samuel when Samuel asked him about it. We don't know how true that was. It was certainly true that they were planning on sacrificing some of it at least. And Samuel told him, "Has Yahweh as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Yahweh?" In chapter 15, verse 22, he says this, "Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of Yahweh, he has also rejected you from being king." And in the very next chapter, Samuel goes to the house of Jesse and anoints his youngest son, David, to be the next king. And you know the story. If you don't know the story, if you're forgetting what went on and how all this came about, read 1 Samuel. I'm giving more of an overview of this section because you have it in front of you. Anytime you want to, you can go back and research it. And as I've said before, I'm going to really emphasize the parts of history that are not in the Bible that we're less familiar with, the parts that would be more difficult to study on your own. But there was a very tense relationship between David and Saul. And for time's sake, I'm not going to probably read everything. Here we go. Yeah, David entered Saul's service. Sorry, just finding my place. As a harpist. We know from the story of David and Goliath right after this, that to Saul, David was a staff member at this time. He didn't really know David's family background. He was just the guy that came in and played a harp for Saul. But of course, after the incident with Goliath, David became a lot more. There was a friendship that came about between David and Jonathan. They both had a very similar faith in God, a passion for God, and they recognized that in each other. And David, since he had demonstrated his military ability, Saul put him in charge of a portion of his army, and David began to acquire more and more fame until his fame as a young hero eclipsed Saul's fame as king. And all of these things ultimately led to David acquiring the kingship as God had promised him. Would somebody like to look up Psalm 78? The very end of the psalm. It goes through the history of Israel, basically. 72 verses is long, of course, for a psalm, but it traces the whole history of Israel up to that point, and the capstone of that history at that time is found in verses 70 through 72. Someone have that? David was a skillful king, a skillful shepherd for the people of God. God took him from taking care of the flocks to leading the nation, and it was the greatest blessing that God could have given to the nation. He led them well. And one of the most significant things about David's reign, and this is probably what David would tell you was the most significant thing that he did during his reign, was he took Jerusalem, he made it his capital, and he brought the Ark of God there so that he could live in the same city as the Ark of God, that God could be back with his people, that the priesthood could be reestablished as it was before the time of Samuel. And this is something that comes up again and again in the Psalms, which we've been going through on Wednesday night. David's desire to be near God, to be in his presence, to worship in his sanctuary. But after he had done that, after he had brought the ark into Jerusalem, and we'll just rush through this quick. This is the last thing we have to look at. David desired to build a house. That was the next thing on his agenda, to build a temple, a permanent house for God in Jerusalem. He planned to do it in 2 Samuel chapter 7. We see the fact that he's unhappy that he dwells in a house of cedar and God is dwelling in a tent. He sees that as very wrong. So he makes plans. We see the prophet Nathan has that relationship with David. The prophets and the kings work together. The prophet is the go-between between the king and God to give him instructions. And at first, Nathan says, clearly God is with you. God is in all of this. Sure, go ahead. That is the next step. But God comes to Nathan and tells him, no, that's something that I have planned for David's son. But God very much honors David's desire to build him a house. And the promise he makes to David is just beautiful. Down in verse 8. So now, thus you shall say to my servant David, God said to Nathan, thus says Yahweh of hosts, I myself took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you have gone, and have cut off all your enemies from before you, and I will make you a great name, like the name of the great men who are on the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in their own place and not be disturbed again. And the unrighteous will not afflict them any more as formerly, even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Yahweh also declares to you that Yahweh will make a house for you. David wanted to build God a house. God says, I am going to build you a house. And he goes on to explain that his kingdom, David's kingdom, will be established forever, that he will not turn away from David the way that he turned away from Saul. That his line, his house, will be established forever. And we know that ultimately that's a prophecy regarding Christ. Christ was a son of David, and he will be king. He will rule over the nation always.